Always choose orange.
Hello and welcome to Always Choose Orange, the show that provides actionable ways to develop and maintain a thriving creative process. I'm your host, Alex Acanero, and today with me is Matt Booker. Matt is the author of the Belan Deck and co-host with Dave Laird of the Concavity Show podcast. He's one of the founders of the International David Foster Wallace Society and administers the Wallace L listserv. Matt's writing has been published in Electric Literature, the Dublin Review of Books, Puerto del Sol, Publishers Weekly, amongst other places as well. He currently lives in Austin, Texas. Matt, I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So where I want to start is I recently read the Belan Deck a couple months ago. Read through it, really loved it. Just such a, it shifted the way that I think of PowerPoint decks, which is something that I see a lot, at my job. I work a corporate job, and it really helped me also work through some of the things that I think a lot of people have been going through, at least since 2023. I think when you put the book out, but just sort of AI questions and what does this mean for artists? What does this mean, as a society and stuff like that. So I loved the book. I loved it the first time I read it. I actually read it again in preparation for this conversation, and like all good books, you kind of find more and more things the more and more you read it. So I thoroughly enjoyed it the second time too, and I'm just excited to talk to you
Thanks.
about how it came together. So, my first question is just for people, if people are listening or watching and have never heard of the book before, I'd love for you to sort of just quickly sum up the main premise of it, and then I have a bunch of questions about how it came together.
Yeah, sure. So the book is basically all in one guy's head, and it starts of him going to the airport in San Francisco, and nothing much happens. He goes to the airport, and he's thinking about his day and his life and reality, and then he gets on the plane home, and that's the end of the book. As you alluded to, there's some other things on his mind, which is that he maybe works for a company that is AI, machine learning related, and he really kind of hates his boss or resents his boss asking him to make this big PowerPoint deck. And it's the modern condition of having like too much work on the brain. He's on a work trip, he's going home, and the pointlessness of AI kind of pervades a lot of that thinking. But to your point as the book, if we take a step back, um, maybe you're one of my ideal readers then, is like if you've had some experience with a corporate job and yet feeling like you're ultimately a creative person, um, and yet you're being asked to make a bunch of PowerPoints and you spend your time doing something you hate. That's sort of like again, that's like the nature of work. People do that all the time to do stuff they don't really care for, but they want the money. And so, um, I feel like that's a universal problem. But people who have some literary background, but also some maybe corporate background, that's sort of what I was aiming at.
Yeah, and I would imagine I think you're totally right. I think I am sort of your ideal reader because when I first heard the premise, so I actually learned about the book from Austin Kleon's newsletter. I'm
Okay.
sure a lot of people did. He gave you like a very stellar shout out in there, and the way he described it, I was like, oh, I have to read this. This sounds really fascinating, and it certainly didn't let me down. But the first question, I guess, jumping off into how it came together, I'm super curious. Just how did the initial idea first come to you? Sort of how did like where did it start?
Yeah, so it really started with David Markson's books. Have you read any David Markson's books? Yeah.
So I never had, but after I read the Belan deck, I did a tiny bit of research into it because I'd never read anything like that before. And I listened to the episode that you guys did on your podcast about the book. I listened to a little bit over half of it. I didn't want to like spoil all the questions I was going to ask you, so I kind of stopped it there. But anyways, I heard you guys talking about David Markson, and so I went and read his last three books
Yeah.
and really enjoyed them, but I'd never read anything like that. So to answer your question, yes, a little bit
Yeah,
familiar
so
now.
that's where, a lot of the inspiration for the book came from, is that I love that style, which is very short sort of paragraphs. and a lot of facts that he gleaned from reading just thousands of biographies. And Markson's a much better writer than me. He's a much more man of his time. Like, I mean, he was, uh, extremely accomplished writer, and was friends with like Jack Kerouac in the 1950s, and spent a lot of time reading. And so, Wittgenstein's Mistress, starting from that book on, his style, his late style, really changed into a lot of sort of um, kind of collage, right? Like he was putting together the pieces of things that interested him. And I really like that style, but he died in 2010. And the idea for me was that it's too bad he's not alive, right? Because there's a lot of still interesting coincidences and facts and trivia and things happening in the world. And also I realized like I was just interested in different stuff than he was. And like if I were to compile things that interested me, they might not necessarily interest David Markson, but might be more of interest to people closer to my age rather than, his age. He's, 50, 60 years older than me. So that was part of the thinking, is like, what if he had lived and written more? And not, again, not that I could live up to him as a writer, but I think I wanted to find a frame to put all of that stuff together. And to me, it fits very nicely with the sort of encyclopedic style that's changed. Like, obviously, I'm big into David Foster Wallace, and so a lot of Wallace's stuff gets called encyclopedic. But I think, Wallace didn't really live to see the explosion of Wikipedia. And like the Wikipedia style, that was sort of intriguing to me as well. Like, what if, David Markson lived and was born 60 years later? And what if, you know, the encyclopedic style became more of like the Wikipedia style?
Yeah.
And so that combined a lot of things that I loved. And I actually wrote a different version of the book in like 2014 that was more focused on David Markson, and I ended up like throwing that away. I mean, I had a whole different set of facts and framing device and everything, but when I sat down to write, like just naturally, that's the style that came to me. Is I compiled a lot of the stuff that I found really interesting, and I wanted to keep compiling it, right? And so from 2014 to like 2020, maybe 2015 to 2020, I compiled a bunch more facts, and like marks on note cards, right? And I was shuffling them around, and I don't, I Markson's books, for those who haven't read it, like This Is Not a Novel, Reader's Block, Vanishing Point, and the last novel, those are all like, there's very little framing device. It's just, here's a bunch of facts, and there's themes that emerge throughout the book. So Reader's Block has a little more of a framing device, but I didn't want to do something that was pure facts with no framing device. And so for me, it was very easy to write about work because I spend like 8 hours a day doing it. So, that's sort of the genesis of the book.
Okay. Okay. And then with David Markson, so like I said, I've only read his last three, which were, like you said, very little framing, just sort of juxtaposition of really fascinating quotes, tidbits about people's lives and stuff like that. Was his earlier stuff more like what you did in the Belan deck? And the reason I say that is because something that I really enjoyed the Marks and stuff that I read, like all three of those. It was really, really cool. But I like what I really liked about the Belan deck is that grounding it in tangible imagery and then jumping into the sort of Wikipedia rabbit hole, sort of quotes and the David Markson style. So I was just curious, I guess, is that like what his previous stuff was, or was that kind of just what you brought to it, approaching it your way?
No, I think that was kind of just my take on it. His earlier stuff is totally different and is much more speculative, and sort of not realistic. Like I loved Wittgenstein's Mistress, and I love Reader's Block as well. There's a lot of similarities between them, but they're much more just straight fictional, right? Like
Okay.
dystopian, like what if there was no one left on the planet, or what if someone was extremely mentally ill, or what if, they're much more um pure fiction, whereas I think mine is sort of a hybrid of memoir and collage and fiction as well. So I didn't have a boss named Belan.
Yeah.
That's made up. But there's a lot in there that is pretty close to memoir. And I think that's most fiction that's being written these days is a mix of like taking something that is lived experience and changing it a bit.
With I was gonna ask you about the memoir piece, so I'm super glad you brought it up because I was gonna ask, like Leo Stephen Beelan's diaries in there, and as well as like the details about that photo exhibit at the San Francisco airport and stuff. I was gonna ask you, and not obviously like every single piece of the book that's memoir or whatever. I'm not asking you to explain all that necessarily, but just kind of what was it like to balance sort of the parts that you were making up with the real life stuff, because that was something I started writing when I was in college, and I would try to write stories based on real life, and I would hang way too close to the real life thing and not be able to tap into fiction. So I really admire that you were able to move in and out of that. So I'm just curious, like, is there any certain way that you thought about it, or was it just come naturally to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's two things going on. One is that, this experience of like traveling for business is very much common for me. And like there was one year where I probably went back and forth to San Francisco like 9 or 10 times in a year. And so I was spending a lot of time at the airport, which I kind of loved, but I liked the sort of more idealized version of that business travel than the reality of it. I don't think it was that interesting. So the book is partly my attempt to make that experience more interesting to myself. But the memoir part of it is also like Leo Stephen Beelan really is someone in my family tree and like someone who I think is extremely fascinating and someone who I think is probably the most interesting human being in my family tree. And some people don't give a shit about genealogy. They can't name all of their great great grandparents. Um, I've always been interested in it, and partly because it's full of stories. Like if you have the willingness to go and read a bunch of stuff and do the research, you can find some interesting stories in your family tree. Um, and Leo Stephen Beelan was a person who I find extremely interesting as a person. And to me, that's not my last name, right? Like, um, he was adopted. And so he got adopted at age 21, which is mentioned in the book, which is like, I'd never heard of such a thing. I mean, even in, even 100 years ago, it was super rare to be adopted at age 21. And so there's just a ton of interesting stories about this guy. And I think ultimately, that people who are interested in that, like myself, if you're interested in your ancestors, it's sort of like trying to figure out, who am I? Who did I come from? And, I have kids now that I hope that someday they do get interested in their background and their history and say, where you came from, there is some interesting stuff back in there. Maybe it's not as well documented, but you can document your life. And even if it only serves a handful of people who are related to you, they might find it interesting. And so, if that stuff was not documented about the real Beelan, which I actually have a picture of him over here. I was going to
Oh,
see that
awesome. Yeah.
picture, see that round
Yeah.
picture. That's
Up in the
him.
upper right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's him in World War One. And he was born in Berlin, Germany, as I say in the book, in 1890, and he ended up fighting in World War One, on the American side, which is crazy, as he spoke
Yeah.
German his whole life, and he was adopted. And it is a crazy story that he basically chose to leave behind um, his family, who immigrated to the U.S. with him, but he left them behind and joined another family. And so in this book, there is some like contemplation that the family is a bit abstract. We don't actually meet the wife or the kids or anyone else. And there's a lot of coming and going, right? Like people in the airport. Um, there is some going home to the wife, but it's sort of off stage. So that's just a little bit of background on, what I wanted to fit in there. Like I put that stuff in there because I'm interested in it.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it also gets at sort of, yeah, like you were saying, that idea of lineage and all the stories that come through the lineage, and then that sort of like paired alongside sort of the AI examination is very interesting because a machine wouldn't have that sort of lineage also, and that seems to be something that makes the narrator human. And I kind of love that like there's all these different things in the book that are examining what is human, and what is machine, and sort of that Wikipedia rabbit hole. I think I wrote down like the actual quote here that really stood out to me. It said, "The Wikipedia rabbit hole as art, as immersive escape." I really, really liked that line in the book, and so I was just curious, if you mentioned earlier encyclopedic versus sort of like Wikipedic, if that's even the right way of saying that, sort of ways of exploring things. And I was curious if you could kind of just describe the difference between those two things and like what you were sort of hooking, latching onto with the Wikipedia references.
Yeah, so I'm of the age where I was growing up without the internet, right? Like I didn't have access to the internet until really my senior year of high school when I went to college. Um, and so growing up, we had a set of encyclopedias in the house, maybe a couple sets of encyclopedias, and I absolutely loved just picking up the encyclopedia and pick a letter and start reading through it and flipping through it and discovering things. There was a sense of like serendipity that you would discover something that would answer a question you'd always had, and you didn't know that you were looking for the answer until you found it. And when Wikipedia launched, it wasn't that great. Like I remember getting a CD-ROM of Encarta by Microsoft and thinking Encarta was great. Um, but I liked Wikipedia in that I knew instantly it was going to be transformative in that it could hold just millions of articles, billion, infinite number of articles. And like this is the sort of repository of all human knowledge. Who wouldn't love that? And I, quickly started adding what I could. I am still to this day a Wikipedia editor. I edit articles. I have created some. I have, spent a lot of time on Wikipedia. I think it is one of the most enduring, lasting human projects um, in existence. So for me, the other piece of it is if you've ever had an office job and you're bored at work and a lot of stuff is banned that you can't just go surfing on, um, open up Wikipedia and you can click around and you'll probably find something interesting. Or it's a curiosity agent in that if you're curious about literally any topic, read the Wikipedia article on it. And this is a very dad statement, like I'm aware of it. Like a lot of this is a cliche with like dads are like, oh, I never heard of, Chapel Roan. I'll go read the Wikipedia article on Chapel Roan. But I don't knock that because I still do stuff like that. And that to me is like, for better or worse, the way that we have decided to transmit a lot of shared knowledge. So I'm probably the prime candidate to spend a lot of time on Wikipedia, um, partly because I love a lot of different subjects, and I sort of consider myself a generalist rather than a specialist. And I'll tell you, I don't know if you've ever done this at work, but I had to do like a strengths finder. Do you
Yeah.
familiar with that? Strengths
Yeah.
finder. And I did this probably 10 years ago, and like my number one strength was input.
Mm.
And I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
That's like a noun. It's not a verb. Like what is input? I mean, I guess it could be a verb, but I was like, it's really abstract as a strength. Like I didn't get that. And so then I read more about the Strengths Finder definition of input, and it was like, you're probably a book collector who
Mm.
likes getting a lot of different input from a lot of different sources. And I was like, oh yeah, that's absolutely me, who I am, is I love just getting a lot of information and input and scrolling a lot and like reading a lot. And so Wikipedia really caters to that, man.
Is that how you located a lot of the quotes and facts in the book? I'm super curious as to how all of that came together. Like you mentioned, 2014, you had the initial version of the book, writing it on the note cards in, the David Markson style. At the time when you were doing that, both the first version of the book and like the current version of the book, I'm just curious as to number one, did you know that you were writing these facts on the note card to form a book, or was it just something that you were doing as sort of an experiment? And then I guess, yeah, we could just start there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was a lot that I wrote down that didn't make it into the book. And, maybe we'll talk more about that in terms of process because I just collect stuff that I think is interesting and that I hope that I can use later. And there's some stuff that um, is interesting, but it didn't really fit into the book. And then there's some other stuff that I intentionally sought out um, because I was curious about it for the book. One of it being the history of SFO.
Mm,
And for people who haven't read the book, um, San Francisco Airport, where it's located, um, there's a little kind of suburb of San Francisco south of town called Millbrae, and it used to be called Mills Field. And I was like, well, who is this Mills? So I started reading more about the Mills family, and they were incredibly wealthy. And like any good biography in Wikipedia, you'll discover all kinds of crazy links and coincidences. And one of them that was in there was about Seabiscuit. And I was like, what the fuck? I hear 5 minutes ago, I'm reading about SFO. Now I'm reading about Seabiscuit and horse racing in the 1930s. And for me, this goes back, I was able to relate that back to my interest in my great grandfather Belan because of the technology of horses, and that horse was a revolutionary technology for human beings for hundreds of years, not just as a form of transportation, as a form of work, as a form of companionship, in a way that I think we were developing AI
mm.
to be a form of work, to be a form of companionship, to be a sort of way to make a living. And so the guy in the book, the character, basically me, is working for a technology company that thinks they're doing something revolutionary by creating artificial intelligence. And yet there's an undercurrent, there's a sort of theme in this book that horses were maybe more valuable and more intelligent, or were felt that way less than 100 years ago. And really, it was not until the 1920s, 100 years ago, that cars were even popularized and dominant. So there's more to the sort of themes that are connected loosely across the book. The guy's mind is wandering, but for me, Wikipedia is invaluable in that before when I was in high school, I would have to go to the library, find a book about airports, hoped they had something about San Francisco Airport in there, maybe then say, oh, I need to go look at this guy Mills, and then hope that they had a book about that. And now, like, all of that is just compressed into instantaneous information, and that's irresistible to me.
Yeah. And you can just click any link and it's sort of everything's nested within each other. I love that aspect of it. A couple of my friends and I, we used to like Wikipedia race. So we'd pick a topic and say like the
Yeah,
Pope and who can get to the Pope in the least amount of clicks from a random article that you start on and stuff.
yeah,
And I
I'm
just,
really good at that. And
yeah,
there's Kevin Bacon, right? 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you can try to relate someone back to Kevin Bacon or the Pope, and any Wikipedia article is connected to another article. So it's possible. I think it's just a number of clicks. Like, is it going to be 100? Is it going to be 10? Um, and that to me is like comforting.
yeah. And like what I love about the book too, and the way that you put it together, like, and it's really cool that you just mentioned that you were sitting at the airport, or whether or not you were actually there, but thinking about the
I
airport and
was.
looking at the history of it. Um, I think that's what makes, as I was reading the book, I'm like, this is exactly what someone could or would experience while sitting at the airport. Like it's such a believable thought train. Like the way that things are connected felt very fluid as opposed to contrived. I feel like some books, when they have characters thinking, it feels very contrived in the sense that it's not how a human actually thinks. And so I really, enjoyed the way that you examine that in the book. So that's really cool that it was like authentic to you were actually wondering these things.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, have always, like I said, preferred books where the focus is more on the characters than the plot. And like, I don't think for most people there's something really incredible that has happened in your life. Like, I've never been in a war, I've never flown a helicopter, I've never like robbed a bank. Like, I don't have a lot of really exciting stories to tell. And so it's more about the access to someone else's thinking. And, maybe there's this like Ralph Waldo Emerson quote that's about like, thinking, a person's thinking is their life. And
Mm.
if you want access to someone else's life, you want to get in their head, but it's really hard to open up your own head that way. Or people don't like it. And I mean, there's plenty of that too. Like
Yeah.
I think somewhere in the book is like the deck that this guy's building is sort of a proxy for the book. And it's like it's not for everyone. And I feel that way about literature in general, is like not every book is meant to be for everyone. And that's totally okay. Like if this is not the book for you, fine, move on. If, I don't know, Great Gatsby is not the book for you, fine, move on. It's not for you. Um, but for me, the a lot of the books, this is another quote, Cormac McCarthy, like books are made out of books.
Yeah.
And to me, any book that you make is the product of like all the reading you've done in your whole life. Some of that is going to have to seep in there some way. And so for me, I just like turn that to 10, let as much of that in as I could.
So getting back to the craft piece, so you were talking about both on like the original version and sort of this later version, you started by handwriting the stuff on the note card. So I'm just curious if you can kind of, as much as you remember, walk through sort of the process of putting this book together. So I'm super curious, just like you had this idea, you started the version in 2014. I'm curious as to like kind of how long that took, like what parts you did by hand, what you typed out, sort of how many drafts you went through, just kind of as much as you remember about how it came together to what it is today.
Yeah, so I remember reading about Markson's process and sort of copying it, where he wrote on to index cards. So I bought a ton of index cards, and he said somewhere in an interview that like once he had filled up two shoebox lids full of index cards, that was a book. And dude, it took me years, and I filled up like one shoebox top full of index cards, and I was like, this is going to take forever. Um, and I ended up not using like most of that. So for me, the appeal of it was what you could, if you saw something interesting, saying like, "Hey, did you know Christopher Reeves, who played Superman, he was also in a carnival?" And they're like, "What? He was a carnival guy?" I'm gonna write that down. Maybe it's not useful, but then you read something later about like, as a small boy, Beethoven called himself Superman and worked in a carnival, and be like, "Oh shit, I have a card on that. I can go put that card together." Um, I also think, it's a very short book. All the paragraphs are very short. Could be every paragraph in the book could be written on an index card. And to me, that also fits very well with sort of my obsession with Twitter,
Mm.
and that each sort of paragraph is about the length of a tweet. And I really wanted to mimic something that was adaptable for our current day readers, and that I even as a longtime reader myself, a book lover, I find it hard sometimes to sit down with just a wall of texts. Like I have to really focus on it. But if it's just physically broken up on the page into little paragraphs, I'm like, it's a little more digestible. And so I modeled that, starting with the index cards, where if it couldn't fit on the index card, I need to break it up, put it into two or three index cards. Um, for me, also writing by hand has this benefit of um, I could edit it easy on an index card. I could erase stuff. I always write in pencil, and I also liked the idea that you didn't need Wi-Fi to do it, right? You didn't need your work laptop to do it, and there were times where honestly my work laptop couldn't access the websites that I wanted to, or I didn't want to be tracked accessing the websites that I wanted to. And so for me, being offline and writing by hand was a great benefit. And I still do that to this day. I prefer writing by hand. And then I would transcribe stuff actually first into a Google Doc that, I could access from my phone or from any other computer in the world just through my Google account. And that Google Doc, has the benefit of being searchable, right? So if I could say, oh, did I have anything on Walt Whitman? Yes, I want to go look up Walt Whitman or Charles Darwin. Oh, I think I wrote something year ago about Charles Darwin. I don't have to sort through 500 index cards. I can just do a find. But then for the book, I took sort of the raw material of that Google Doc and then started a new document just in Microsoft Word where this is going to be the book, right? Like in Microsoft Word. And as I'm going through writing it, I could say, okay, now I need a piece about, Abraham Lincoln or David Foster Wallace. And then I could go back and search that Google Doc, sort of mine the raw material, transcribed all of the index cards, and then put it into the Word doc. And the Word doc became essentially the manuscript. So that's the process. It's a little bit laborious, but
Yeah.
that's what worked for me.
When you got an initial version done, did you do multiple drafts, or because it's so like concise, did you sort of edit as you go?
Yeah, I did a couple of full drafts where I hit stop and I said, I sent it out to an editor and I had a copy editor look at it and I got some changes back. And the temptation, like any book, is just to keep tinkering with it, right? And to say, oh, well, since I've done that draft, I've got 10 new facts that I need to fit in here somewhere, right? And I can keep tinkering with it. So I did get satisfied enough, I think, with the draft where I could say, this is the book, and I'm happy with it just being this sort of container. And you can always add to it, but what I ended up doing is starting another Google Doc. So since this book has come out, you mentioned in 2023, I mean, I filled up a whole nother couple of hundreds of index cards and kept writing every day and basically wrote a sequel to this.
Awesome.
So that's pretty much done. I hope to have it announced soon, but it is in process of another one just like this. So that's my solution to it is stop tinkering with this book, leave it alone, and just make a whole new thing. So um, yeah, that's basically it.
Was that challenging to get yourself to do? I'm in the reason I'm like so interested in the answer to that question is I'm in the middle of the process of finishing my first novel and I'm on like the ninth draft and I keep tinkering with it and I just sent it to a round of people and I'm getting a little bit better, but I'm kind of caught up in what you just mentioned, which is like I can keep adding things, I can keep tweaking things, I can keep replacing it. How did you get yourself comfortable to just end it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the standard for me is something I saw from Harry Crews, the writer Harry Crews, a big inspiration for me. And that guy had something that said, the greatest pleasure in life is having written something you're proud of. And to me, that was the standard. And it's like I got to the point with the draft where I said, if I were to, put this out in the world today, am I happy with this? Am I proud of it? And for me, that answer eventually became yes. And I- I also I think had more ideas that I wanted to pursue beyond that. So I really needed to end that book and move on with a different idea. And that's like I say, the new book that's coming out this year will have a lot of the same themes or content even, but in a totally different format. And so I still have other things that I want to do, and I know to do them, I have to finish the one that's, in process. So.
Do you find that when you get locked in on one project that that sort of takes up the mental space for other creative things, or are you able to kind of do a couple things at the same time?
I mean, obviously, I always jump around, right? I jump
Yeah.
around a lot, but I really do like the idea of being done with something
Yeah.
and being able to focus on something else. And obviously, my work is a lot more like collage. And like when you're doing collage stuff, you can always be collecting. You can always put stuff together, but then anyone can do that. Anyone can cut out stuff from a magazine, but it's more like how you put it all together. And so for me, putting stuff together, is a discrete project, right? And so I have a discrete project that is a manuscript and then it's done, and then I'm able to luckily focus on another thing. And it's like I say, that's just the system that works for me because I don't write like a very linear path. Like I don't say, today I'm going to do chapter one, tomorrow I'm going to do chapter two. There's always like tinkering.
Were you jumping around in the narrative like that as
Oh yeah.
well? Okay.
Oh yeah. Constantly. And I mean, that's sort of just like, I think that's our reality, like you're watching a TV show of a movie that came out, or you're watching TV, but you're on your phone looking at something that's published right now, and someone's talking to you about this, and then you get a text, and then you look at a tweet. It's like our whole reality is fragmented, and our minds are always jumping around and fragmented. Like it's impossible not to think that way. And so for me, I find it really hard to relate to stuff sometimes that is really linear, that's like it better be good, man. Better be a good story, or else I'm struggling, because my brain is broken by our society, and I'm blaming them, but rather than myself. I'm
Sure,
sure
sure.
there's other ways better than me, but
Absolutely. So you mentioned having an editor, copy editor read it. I'm curious as to what sort of your relationship with other people in terms of their feedback and stuff for the book was. So did you have beta readers or friends read it and stuff as well, or who all was kind of involved in helping you shape it into what it is?
yeah, actually there was very little of this on this one. I do have a few first readers who, I sent drafts to, and they sent me stuff back. There are a few people, who I really trust, or I would say they were my sort of ideal readers. I'll give a shout out to my friend Don Huff, who has always been one of my first readers, and I really respect him as a writer as well. And so, we have a good symbiotic sort of relationship where he'll read my stuff and I'll read his. For this book, I struggled with getting it published. And just in general, I think there's not much of a big mass market for books like this. And I think I probably pitched it wrong, where you sort of needed to, in my mind, you either needed to know something about corporate America or David Markson to make sense of it. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. So I don't know that I did myself any favors that. But, when I first published the book, I sent it again to some other people who I really hoped would read it. And one of those, wrote me back really nice stuff that I ended up putting on the cover of the next edition, which was Stephen Moore.
Oh, cool.
And Stephen Moore, if you don't know, David Markson's book, Wittgenstein's Mistress, is dedicated to Stephen Moore because he is the one who took a chance on sort of Markson's whole style.
Mm.
And so for me, he was Markson's editor at Dalkey Archive Press. And, I've become friends with Steve over the years through the David Foster Wallace stuff and Alexander Theroux stuff. And Steve's retired now and everything, but he's really one of the best readers, I think, in American history. And he wrote a 2-volume set of books called The Novel. So if you ever want to actually learn about the novel, go read Stephen Moore's book. Volume one of which is like beginnings up to Don Quixote. Most people think the novel began with Don Quixote. He's got a whole history before Don Quixote. So for me, that was sort of like if Stephen Moore read the book and liked it, I didn't really give a crap what anyone else thought. And that was a sort of, my low bar for success. I'm not going to sell a million copies, but like, my God, if Stephen Moore said anything decent about it, I was going to die happy. So.
When you did you just end up hiring just a copy editor just to make sure that you caught all the stuff, or what kind of
Yeah,
scores you do?
so my the book's published through my brother's company, which is Sideshow Media Group. And so we have all of that through Sideshow Media Group.
Okay.
And, I was just really lucky that, my brothers and I, we've always sort of had the same interests and been supportive. I live in Austin, both my brothers live in LA. And this is sort of one way we keep in touch is just by um, what is everyone working on and what is everyone doing. And both my brothers have both written and published more than I have. Um, but yeah, I mean that's the short answer
Yeah.
is Sideshow Media Group is sort of a family business.
Okay, got it. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Was there any from the first readers and stuff, was there any feedback that you can remember, like maybe one piece of feedback that helped that really like changed things for you? Was there anything that, yeah, that really shaped how you approached the book?
Maybe after the fact, there was some feedback that um, I feel like I could have made the book better in some ways, but that's really hard to reckon with when you get to a point, like I said, where that standard for me is like, am I proud of it? Am I happy with it? Would I have changed things? Could I have made it better? Sure. But one piece of feedback, that I got was some really granular stuff, and I guess maybe every writer deals with this where you think, oh God, what I said on page, 154 or what I said on page 90, I'm really like going back and forth about this, and it ends up derailing like a week of thought and frustration. And there's sections of this book that are really more like a poem, and every word sort of matters. And so I really like go back and forth over rewriting one page of it or one paragraph. And I think in the end, a lot of that doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Um, I think a lot of it is like the rhythm. I would say the thing that mattered ultimately to me was, and I don't remember who said this, is really like as a reader and as a writer, you have to be in the same rhythm. And if you can establish that sort of rhythm, it's very easy to recognize when you're out of rhythm.
Hmm.
And I think that the pieces that I ended up cutting or changing to me just felt like, it's like when someone is in a band and they play the wrong note. It's like, we'll go back and cut that. Um, and there might still be some wrong notes in the book. I don't know. I'm not going to go back and be too critical of my old self because I feel like I am more focused now on moving on. But I think that rhythm thing is really important, especially for this kind of a book, which is so fragmentary.
Each of the sentences carry so much weight the way that a tweet does, comparing it to how you were saying earlier. And that's a cool experience of the book is it's fragmentary, like you said, and fast paced, but at the same time, if you want to, you can slow down and isolate one line and sort of meditate on it for a while. So like I have a few lines in front of me that I wrote down just in case I would want to reference them during this. So like one line that I sat and thought about for a while was a chicken is only the method an egg uses to make another egg. I was just sitting there and I was like, just that's a whole like thought process. So I really enjoy that about the novel as well. And I think that that's like you said, that's part of that is rhythm, part of that is paying so much attention to sentences. Did you sort of fiddle with like the phrasing on certain stuff a lot as you went through?
Yeah, and I think one thing I struggled with a bit was uh, there are some pieces of the book that are basically just stolen from other books.
Mm-hmm.
It's just cut and paste from other books.
Yeah.
And, and some of it, unless you've read every single book that I have ever read in my life, you won't pick up on. And to me, I was sort of empowered by reading Austin Kleon's book, Steal Like an Artist. And that I was like, if you do this right, and if it fits in the right context, no one will notice or no one will care
Yeah.
that you've stolen the exact line. And, I see that in terms of music or film, where there's a recreation of a beat or a frame or a shot that is paying homage in a way, but also, it's in a different context. And so I think people don't care as much um, in non-written media, and I just try to make some of that my own. So I would say I did worry some about like, do certain lines make sense or certain facts fit together well, but um, there was also the opposite effect where sometimes I would forget that I had written something and I would go back and read it again and be like, oh, I forgot I wrote that. That was actually pretty good. Um, so I think it can work both ways.
Yeah. And That's really cool. And what it reminds me of a couple things. So it reminds me of like in hip hop music, like the idea of sampling where you're just chopping different pieces of old songs and you're recontextualizing them. And I would imagine you've probably read this book, but it reminded me of Reality Hunger by David Shields. Yeah. Uh,
Dude, I have it right here.
oh, amazing. So like I love that sort of that whole a lot of the ideas in that book like are realized in what you did here, and that's it worked super well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's one of those books where if you were to read Reality Hunger first and then read my book, you would see some sentences verbatim taken
Oh,
from Reality Hunger.
nice.
David Shields always been a big inspiration for me, and I mean that being his sort of manifesto, yeah, that had a big impact on me. Um, and you know what you say about hip hop too, I think going back to the publishing piece of this is that it's quite different in music or film when something is made independently. And in a way, it sort of gives it more cred that it's not from a big studio. It's not from one of the big um, labels. It's something, that someone made totally independently. And I think not only does it give it more cred, some people don't care about or don't even know what the major music labels are in the country anymore, or the major movie studios that actually finance versus the distributors. And so it's different with publishing, right? In a way, it's a lot easier to write a book and anyone can like publish it. Um, but the idea of it being independently published is just weird in books, whereas people think like, oh, is that a New Directions book? Is that a Dalkey Archive book? Who published that? Who published it? Who's the publisher? They care more about the publisher in books, but I think that that's maybe changing for the better in some ways.
From okay, so here's an interesting question that sort of just came up as you were speaking about taking parts verbatim. Is that like because I know in music, right, you have to like clear samples and you have to go through the whole rigmarole to get your stuff, commercially released. Is that an issue with literature, or do people only care if it like hits the New York Times bestseller list? Did you have to jump through any hoops to do that, or does it matter?
And it didn't even occur to me to go
Yeah.
and get permissions for that. And I say that as someone who worked in book publishing for many years and had to go get permissions to quote anything.
Okay.
It's frankly, it's absurd.
Yeah.
And I think, no, it's for at least in my book is like a sort of textbook definition of fair use.
Yeah.
And I think there's no one who is going to come after me for not giving permission. And a lot of it was intentionally so oblique that you wouldn't notice,
Yeah.
that you couldn't pick up on. And what Markson, I mean, Markson doesn't either. Like if you look at Markson's books, there's no permissions in the back of it. He's often saying like quoting secondhand what someone else said. So it's not often a direct quote from another book. It's more of like, this is what, Nero said, 2000 years ago. So there's ways around it, but I do think that that whole thing of getting permission for certain quotes, even epigraphs, is bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. What that's one of the things that I loved when I first read Reality Hunger. I was like, finally, somebody's saying all this stuff and just sort of blasting that insane idea of like you can't be inspired. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about was the ending of the book. So the first time that I read the book, I had to check to make sure I was reading it the e-version on the Kindle, and I had to make sure that I was actually at the end. I was like, "What? Why's the next page not loading? Oh my gosh, this is the end!" And so I sat with it, and then when I read it the second time, I completely well, I'm sure there's a lot of ways to interpret it, but I had some interpretations that really worked for me, and I was like, wow, I totally get why this ended here. I was super curious if you're willing to sort of speak on what why you chose to end it there and what your thought process was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's super deep, so I really do want to hear your
Yeah.
interpretations of this. But I think one thing was that the plot of it really didn't matter to me, but there is a sort of linear plot to it, even if it's just a guy goes to the airport, waits for his flight, gets on the flight, and I don't think anything beyond that really matters very
Yeah.
much. So there's some debate, of like, is he going to get on the plane at the very end? But then there's this moment um, where, it ends with his foot sort of on the jetway and then half onto the plane. And we've all had this experience. And it's always kind of freaked me out that you're about to get into one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology on the planet, and yet there's this brief moment where there's like some icy cold wind blowing in, and there's like, oh shit, there's actual like you're actually getting into an aluminum airplane, and there's I've always wanted to pause longer on that moment, and so this book is my way of like trying to own that moment in a way to say anytime now you get on a plane, put your foot half on and half off and look down and think there's actual ground beneath that concrete and you're about to leave that ground. And there's also like a dumber answer here, which is like some of it is related to the Odyssey, and that the briefest summary of the Odyssey is a guy going home to his wife,
Mm.
and whether or not he gets home to his wife is actually kind of anticlimactic. And he gets home to his wife, and it's kind of a fucking disaster, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, I don't really care about the going home part and like, oh, his wife is gonna, do this, blah, blah. He's yell at him, where have you been gone? I didn't want to do that. And I think to me, the Odyssey is what happens before you get home. It's on the trip. And unfortunately, our modern day Odyssey is pretty boring.
Yeah.
Like you go and sit at the bar, go to the bathroom, you get your bag, you get in line. And yet, I don't know that like someone from 2000 years ago, 3000 years ago, they might find it more interesting than we did. And so that just disconnect of leaving the actual Earth and going up into the sky, um, I was just more interested in staying on the Earth.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess to kind of answer your question on like how I took it, just because you said you mentioned you were
Yeah,
curious,
yeah.
like the first time I read it, I um I was just kind of like shocked, I guess, like because I was like as a reader being like, what about the deck? Like, what is the deck done? What does Belan think of
Yeah.
the deck? What's gonna happen, right? So there was like that sort of like, I guess stepping into the shoes of like the everyman and being like, from a pop culture standpoint, I guess expecting like a classic narrative. But the second time I read it, you know, it didn't shock me as much because I knew it was coming. And so I kind of the last couple pages I was thinking, okay, what is this? What does this mean? Like, because I don't like to react to literature or art from a place of like this is good or this is bad. I try to look at like what does this do and what does this mean and why and just assume that like it's like this for a reason. And I'm really glad I did because how I took it was I didn't catch all the nuance that you just said, so that's a really cool perspective too. How I saw it was there was a lot of talk on the last couple pages about sort of this meta commentary on endings. So I can't remember. There was like the quote from Frank Herbert about I don't remember what it was. Oh, there's no real ending. It's just the place where you stop.
Right.
So I kind of took it as like the narrator not knowing where to end things and that sort of being a meta commentary that maybe and again I have no idea if this is true, but it was like maybe you were wondering like how do I end this thing as I'm going through it. But I kind of also took it as a metaphor for the threshold between stepping into a future where AI plays a giant role, because you mentioned sort of this idea on that last page of like the point of no return.
Right.
And we don't know what's going to happen with AI. Everything could be fine. It could also be absolutely bonkers and a point of no return. So I kind of took it as this weird place, that this limbo we're in between the world as it's used to be versus this new technology, which I would imagine people are experiencing, like you said, with the horse to the car. That was probably like a threshold period. And we have all these threshold periods. And so this idea of him being between the airplane gate and the airplane, maybe that's a metaphor for that. So I don't know. That's kind of how I took it. But then I was like, man, I might be thinking too deep about this.
No, I think that's actually really, really smart stuff. And, it's exactly true what you're saying about the comparison with AI, and that there is some real fear behind this, is that we don't really know what the future is going to look like. And that is frightening. And like with horses, there was a time where it was inconceivable that you could live without one. And now, Like it's inconceivable that you would need to be near a horse whatsoever. And that all happened very quickly. And the time where cars and horses overlapped was very short, less than 10 years. Um, where they were truly like streets were 50-50 of horses
Mm.
and cars. It was a very short amount of time. And so I think that our society is changing even quicker, and that, that change that's coming, we don't know. And for me, there's a clear preference for like analog, right? Like writing in pencil, writing in the field notes, writing down stuff and trying to remember them. And like field notes, their motto as a company is like, I'm not writing it down to remember it later. I'm writing it down to remember it now.
Yeah.
And I think to me, I wanted to capture, especially just this moment in time where I was doing a lot of this traveling and thinking about these issues and like, how do I how do I sort of capture, this little moment in time, which again, might be obsolete in 10 years. I don't know.
Yeah, right, right. It might be something that lingers for a while, but it might be something that people look back on and be like, oh, whoa, there was this, yeah, like you said, this period, and it's like a memento of that specific time. That's a cool thing. So a few more questions here before we wrap up. So, um, I've never read David Foster Wallace before because I've been intimidated by how big Infinite Jest is, and so I was curious, like, because you're so immersed in his work. Just I guess what like what what like if someone's interested in jumping into David Foster Wallace, like what's the best place to start? Is it Infinite Jest? Is it something else? Is there?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's two answers. One is like the gateway drug is his journalism, like his essays, his nonfiction, um, cruise ship piece, state fair piece. He's very funny. He's very smart. His voice in the writing is very um, lovable, approachable, fantastic. The other answer is like, you don't need a gateway drug. Go straight to the masterpiece, which is Infinite Jest. And it's sort of like, well, it's a commitment because you're gonna read a 1,000-page novel, right? And I get it. I didn't write a 1,000-page novel. He did. And I don't often tell people like, you need to go read a 1,000-page novel. But for people who are so inclined, if you like something, think of it this way. Wouldn't you want it to never end? Like if you're really into it, you maybe don't want it to be over in 100 pages. Maybe you just want to live in that world for a while. And I'd say you don't have to read the whole thing. Start out with, trying to read 100 pages of it. Um, and I really like it's not because it was written in the 1990s and the late 1980s, it really does feel more modern than trying to read, to me, even Gravity's Rainbow or Ulysses or something like that. So to me, there's a school of thought that's like, before you die, go read a masterpiece. And one of them is Infinite Jest. But sure, go read the essays. All that's great. I mean, if you're really into tennis, go read some of his tennis stuff. I'm not a super tennis dude. I love Infinite Jest. Um, that's sort of my elevator pitch, I guess.
Was Infinite Jest how you stepped into his work or?
I mean, kind of. I'd heard his name before when I was an undergrad, and this was in 1996. I was an English major. I was going to the University of Denver, and we were assigned a short story of his called Linden that was in the Norton Anthology of Contemporary Fiction. And I was like, man, it's fine. Didn't make a big impression on me. I'm interested in Lyndon Johnson. This is kind of a weird take on Lyndon Johnson. But then a few months later, I went to the bookstore, Tattered Cover in Cherry Creek in Denver, and there was this huge stack of paperbacks. And I mean, Cherry Creek Tattered Cover is a huge bookstore. It was 4 floors, 5 floors of the restaurant, and the bargain books was like a whole floor, half a floor. And I swear to God, they had this book stacked up like you see at the grocery store, they have like 7 Up sale, right? It was just like 1,000 of them, right? And it was, I think it was like $8. It was like 7.95 or something. And I just remember like people, everyone who walked by like picked up a copy, and I was like, oh my God, this looks great. Like this looks cool. It's super cheap. And then it was a paperback, and I was like, this looks amazing. And so I bought that and took it home. I didn't make the connection. I'd already read some of his book, and I started reading it. Um, I didn't have a job. I was an undergrad, and so I read like 300 pages of it in a weekend. And instantly, I was like, "This is the best book I've ever read. It's already my favorite book, and I'm 300 pages in." And so I was like, "I got to find someone else to read this book with me," And it's kind of a cliche, like a lot of, especially like white college men, read this book because you have a lot of time on your hands to read 1,000-page book. But to me, it really did live up to the reason why I loved it was not because it was showing off. There was a real heart in it. There's a lot in there about the struggle to be a good human being, to be an adult. And I think I was very interested in that struggle. So it really resonated with me at the time of my life when I read it.
That leads into another question that I was curious about. So these questions are always hard because by nature of omission, you can't include everything. But if you had to pick, let's say, three books that you'd recommend people listening, viewing would read, just because they've meant something to you, either inspired you or something that you just wish more people had read. And again, I know you mentioned earlier, not everything's for everyone, but let's just put that to the side for a second. Like, yeah, I'm just curious as to what you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I've already kind of said an ad for David Markson's books, right? And I think, um, this guy who I really liked, Evan Lavender Smith, he said Markson's books are like porn for English majors. And if you're like me, where you're really into literary history and stuff, you would like all of David Markson's final four books. And the same with Infinite Jest. Like, I don't need to tell you to go read Infinite Jest, anyone else. Like, it's plenty of other people have already said that. Um, I would say for this book in particular, you mentioned David Shields. That was a great mention. There was one other book that was really influential to me when I was writing this book, and the sequel to it sort of comes out this year, um, which is this book called The Heart Aroused by David White. And David White is a poet, uh, and he was sort of given a second lease on life by becoming a consultant to corporate America. And the subtitle of this book is Poetry and the Preservation of the Soul in Corporate America. And I remember when this book came out, it was 1994. I was a senior in high school, and my dad brought this book home. Um, it sold like a billion copies back then. There's a lot of people in corporate America have always had this hunger for how do you preserve an ounce of your real self in a soulless corporate America and this job that you hate. And David White sort of begins with the Inferno of Dante, which is the most famous line from that book. He says, "In the middle of the road of my life, I awoke in a dark wood, and the true way was wholly lost." And I think that feeling of being lost at work, people are looking for a solution to it, right? And the fact that this book came out 30 years ago, to me, it still holds up. It's a genius book. David White's written a ton of other books I would recommend, but start with that one. There's a lot of midlife crisis stuff in there. So let's count Markson Wallace as one, David White as two. The third one I would mention is Moby Dick. Everyone
Oh,
should read Moby Dick. And I just said Wallace is easier to read than a lot of these older ones. Moby Dick being the exception. I think Moby Dick is super accessible and lends itself to rereading, and it's funny and it's full of pathos and it's full of, people brought together to do a common job and full of actual adventure rather than a dude stuck at an airport. Um, and that book to me there's a reason why it is the template of the great American novel. It says a lot about religion and society and America, but in a really entertaining, exciting way. And the voice of Ishmael, who narrates the book, um, you do get into the rhythm of being in his head, and you do want him to continue to narrate what's going on. So for me, Moby Dick is like the great white whale of literature for American literature for a reason. So keep rereading it. I find it just as enjoyable now.
Moby Dick is an absolute masterpiece. I had read part of it in college. I was assigned it, and I was 19 when I tried to read it, and I quit after like 100 pages. And then last year, I kind of sat down and I sort of had that moment that you were kind of describing earlier where you say, I got to read some of these classics. And so I had a copy of Moby Dick. I pulled it open and I remember laying in bed and I was riveted the first like couple chapters, like when he's talking about Nantucket and they're wandering
Mhm.
around. I was blown away by how good that book is because I remember in college when I was 19-year-old me is like, there's a whole chapter on whaling
Yeah.
and what they do with all the parts of a whale. And I'm like riveted by that now. Like you're totally right. That book is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I strongly recommend it. And maybe I have it on the brain right now just because I've been rereading it lately just for fun. So, I mean, there's a lot of other books I would recommend. And I do that, like I say, often on my own podcast.
Yeah.
I have a whole nother show where if you want to see a long list of my favorite books of 2024, I guess I would direct people to go read that list that we just published in January. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would be happy to sit here and go. I could name 10 other books that I'm looking at my shelf right now, just thinking like, oh yeah, I'd love to talk about that book with you or this book and what else is on the brain with me. But just Moby Dick being a big one. David Shields, love all of his books. David White, love all the Davids. David
Yeah.
Foster. Any guy named David's pretty good. So.
I love that. Okay, two or three more here. So, I guess it's since you brought it up, this is something I wanted to talk about too, a tiny bit, which is the podcast. So you were kind of mentioning that you were talking about, sort of some lists of your favorite books and stuff. What else do you guys do on the podcast? Like, if you want to just kind of describe it for people.
Sure. So we started this podcast almost 10 years ago in October of 2015. Dave Laird and I met at the David Foster Wallace Conference, which was in Illinois at the time, and we got stuck at an airport in Chicago O'Hare, and we sat and talked books for like 3 or 4 hours at O'Hare one day. And when he got home, he actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, I was thinking about there's a lot of podcasts out there, but not one just about David Foster Wallace. We should do one just about David Foster Wallace." I said, "Let's do it. I'm in." So I barely knew Dave, and we got to know each other through doing this show about David Foster Wallace and learning about how to make a podcast after that. So for most of our existence, that's mostly what we did was talk to academics and other writers using the sort of pretext of start out talking about David Foster Wallace's stuff. And, that's been a big theme of my life is just that fan community of David Foster Wallace people. Um, and then a few years ago, we sort of expanded it to say, you know what, we want to talk to people, other writers, specifically just about their books, sort of without having to even pretend that we're going to mention David Foster Wallace. And so we changed the name of the show from The Great Concavity to The Concavity Show. And we sort of rebranded, got a new logo. Um, but kind of the joke is that, like, I still end up bringing up David Foster Wallace in every episode, anyways. And so, it's mostly an author interview show where we do bring authors on and talk about their books, but we do also every year try to look back on our own reading and say, what have we read, in the past year? What's our top five, top 10 that we've read? So,
Another question, which is in your work, whether it could be just for the Belan deck, I guess, but for really anything that you create, do you have sort of a guiding thing that you hope people either think, feel, or experience when you make art? Is there some sort of common thing that ties it together?
man, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I do think about, which I basically stole from David Foster Wallace, is whatever you are making is to consider why you are doing it, and really the way he phrases that is like, what is the art's heart's purpose?
Hmm.
And I hope that it's something good, right? I hope that it's not I'm making art to just please myself, or that I'm just doing it to be, rude or evil or mean or something. I think one thing I do believe in, which comes across in this book, is a belief in, creativity. And if that means that you piss off your boss or you end up actually losing your job over it, you have something more valuable, which is your personal creative integrity. And I think it's actually really rare to see that in this day and age. That's why I mentioned the David White book, is I think a lot of people struggle with this, but they don't actually, at the end of the day, like prioritize their own personal creativity. Or if they
Mm.
do, they don't last very long in corporate America.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's sort of one of the dominating themes of my life is just that I didn't grow up thinking I want to work for a giant corporation. But I did think I wanted to be able to, live a comfortable life where I have things like food and shelter and clothing. Um, and it's really hard. Here's another book recommendation that really inspired me. I don't know if you've read it, is Patti Smith's book, Just Kids.
Yes.
And so there's a part in that book where, she moves to New York and she has no money and she refuses to get a day job. And there's this sort of moment in her life where she could have gone down this path that I went down, which is like, I'm going to get a day job to pay the bills and then try to do something creative at night, right? On the weekends. And she knows, even from a very young age, if I go down that path, it's death. I'm not actually going to be an artist. I will not create something if I have to have a day job. And so she's basically starving to death. I mean, she has no food or money, and she's super thin, and she's sick, and she's nowhere to live. And in her mind, that's still being true to herself. That's an extreme case. I don't know that I could do that, but I find it very inspiring.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That that is that is the yeah, it's super relevant, like you said, to what a lot of people are going through. So, to close out, you mentioned that you were working on a sort of the next book. Is there anything else? Well, you could either talk more about that. I just want to give you space if there's anything that you
Yeah.
want to talk about that you're working on or that you're excited about, or just kind of any other last comments. Here's the space.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Like I say, I mentioned I do have a new book coming out this year that will be a sort of sequel to this one, and it's been in the works for a while, but it will be different. So I'm excited to hear if there's any sort of similar reaction to that book. It follows some sort of different rabbit holes. Um, and then, I've thought just like how Markson sort of has that last like trilogy of three books like this, of doing like three, and this would be the second one. But I don't know about that yet. Like the thing that I've always wanted to do, that I'm now working on is more about my experiences of growing up in deep in the woods in East Texas. And when I was growing up, my father was a minister of a very small church, and we lived, say, pretty far out in the middle of the piney woods of East Texas. And this is mostly in the 1980s. And there was a lot of interesting people there, a lot of crazy stories. And like a lot of times, when I was younger and I would tell people these stories, they would be like, wow, man, you should write a book. Um, and I sort of laughed that off, but then I always thought I still have something to say about that interplay of religion and family and sort of American pop culture in the 1980s, um, being sort of isolated out from a big city. And so that's sort of a long-term project that I want to do, that I'm working on now. So I sort of have already transitioned, even though this book is not out yet. It's sort of mentally, I'm already done with that and working on this book of East Texas stories. So I really hope to spend a lot of this year working on that book. And I appreciate your opportunity to come on here and let me just kind of ramble, talk about stuff that is interesting to me. But um, my real life, I have a million other things going on. I'm actually the president of a middle school PTA. I'm on the board of our local library district. I have two kids, one of whom is about to go off to college this year. I'm super involved in all of their sports and activities and school stuff. And so, this is have you read the Knausgaard books? Like Carl
No.
O. Knausgaard. I recommend that, like My Struggle, right? And
Yeah.
book two of that set is like he's complaining about some of the same shit of like he's got a marriage, he's got kids, and yeah, he is a writer and he's struggling to find time to be a writer. And that's kind of the title of the book, right? Like Mein Kampf for him is like the struggle for how to be a writer, how to be an authentic self. And so I find inspiration from him, from all those people who are, they're not doing this full time, right? They're trying to find time to do this. And that's, like I say, I think that's increasingly common as we transition to like just more capitalistic, pure corporation, you know, driven society. So
I fully intended to end with that last question, but you brought up something that I'd be kicking myself if I
keep
didn't ask
going.
you here. So, um, how do you just named a ton of stuff that you're involved in. What works for you to be creative and actually output material in the midst of all that? Like what, yeah, how do you make that work?
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't have a good answer for this because I feel like it's just how I want to spend my free time, and it is a struggle. There's a lot of days where at the end of the day, I don't want to read the book that I know I have to do for the next podcast interview. I
Mhm.
would rather go and read something else. And I don't watch a lot of movies and TV. And I love movies and TV, but it's one of the things that I've had to give up if I want to get other stuff done at night, on the weekends, holidays. So I don't know of a good answer for it. It's just that what I prefer to do um, is to spend time in here. I mean, this is sort of my creative space. You can see in here right now where Joseph Campbell, my older brother John is the executive director of Joseph Campbell Foundation. And Joseph Campbell, a big fan of his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he has this quote. Austin Kleon quotes it. That's like, you need a bliss station. So
Mhm.
there's my advice. It's like, wherever your bliss station is, your couch, your desk, wherever it is that you sit down and it's pure bliss. For me, that's got to be like Blackwing pencils, field notes, all the books that I'm surrounded by. I just feel better, and I ended up spending more time in that bliss station. So build a bliss station. That's my advice.
Yes, yes. Matt, thank you so much for your time, for hopping on here, for talking about the book. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex. It's been great.
Always choose orange.